So next is our first panel on global hate speech. Engaging in a serious discussion about this issue is, I think, the most appropriate way to honor the victims of the mass shootings in New Zealand. I'm very much looking forward to this important conversation and thank the members of the panel who will be joining us. One of our students will be introducing the panel, so let me introduce him. Nishant Mohile from the class of 2020. Where is Nishant? There he is. Nishant comes to his studies in Bloomington from New Delhi. He's a double major in international studies and economics. He may tell you a little bit more about that. He is also president of the campus affiliate of Sigma Iota Rho, the Collegiate International Studies Honor Society. And he's an opinion columnist for the IDU student newspaper. We're very proud to have him start things off for us. Nishant, the podium is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dean Feinstein, for a stirring welcome. What a fitting way to start this conference. This next panel is going to be on global hate speech, a topic, as Dean Feinstein just mentioned, which is all too prescient today. I would like to tell you about myself, though I think Dean Feinstein has done a fabulous job of introducing most of what I do. I'm a student of international studies and economics. I'm also minoring in public policy analysis and Central Eurasian studies. I'm incredibly honored to be serving as the president of Sigma Iota Rho this year, as well as my capacity as an opinion columnist for the IDS. Our moderator for this panel is going to be Dina Temple-Raston. She is a special correspondent for NPR who has reported from both the United States and abroad, and she has spoken on topics including global hate speech and many others. We are so thankful that she is able to volunteer her time to come here. And without further ado, let's welcome her and all our other exemplary panelists.
Yeah, smart.
He said sit by the pictures.
We could just sit under the pictures.
Do you want to sit under?
Yeah, I was thinking it might be easier.
Smart.
Oh yeah, under our pictures.
That's confusing. Right.
I got LASIK, so. Don't wear glasses. I can close one eye so you can sort of recognize who I am. Good morning. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and what we're going to talk about today is, well, when this panel was first conceived, clearly the New Zealand shootings hadn't happened. And as people have mentioned, this is a, you may want to turn that down just a little bit so I don't pop. And as was mentioned, this has made this entire discussion more prescient than it even was before in discussing how hate speech can motivate violence, solutions to it, how we should understand it, its historical perspective. So what we wanted to do today is sort of cover all those things for you, and so that this will not end up being a panel that's an incredible downer. We are also going to be talking about solutions that are actually working. In fact, as we go down the line, I'm hoping things will get more and more optimistic. So you can start negative, no. Okay, so let me briefly introduce our panelists and then we'll dive in. So you may already know Noah Arjomand. He's a Mark Helmke postdoc here. He's an expert on Iran and Turkey. And he's going to help us look at government-sponsored hate speech, and he's a filmmaker too, so we can talk a little bit about some of the projects that he's doing. Agnieszka, that'll be easy. Graff she's an associate professor at the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. She's going to help us look at gender issues of hate speech. And then Suzanne, who is vigorously taking notes, is the CEO of PEN America. And if you've ever heard the word smart power, which I know you have, you can thank Suzanne. She coined that phrase in 2004 in a Foreign Affairs article that if you haven't already read, I'm sure you're going to have to in your classes. She's going to help us look at how we protect free expression in repressive regimes. When people in power here in the US rail against journalists, we don't need to name names, she's one of the people who comes to our rescue, which I personally appreciate a lot. And finally, Sally Smith is the founder of the Nexus Fund, and she's here to save us from despair. Among other things, she's going to talk about how we can help prevent mass atrocities and talk about what some of the young people she's been working with and supporting have done to make us all realize that there are things that we can do individually to change this sort of progression we seem to be on. So, without further ado, let me start by talking about how, while we're very focused on hate speech, it seems sometimes in this country, certainly New Zealand has shown us in stark relief that this is a global phenomenon. So, Noah, let me start with you and have you kind of set the table. Can you talk about the elements that are fueling hate speech, whether it's economics, which in the case of the New Zealand shooter, he certainly thought he was disenfranchised by foreigners, whether it's charismatic leaders or political usefulness, and how is technology changing all of this?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, this isn't by any means a new phenomenon. So even in pre-internet era, believe it or not, there was hate speech. I'm teaching a course called Global Fake News, and next week we'll actually be talking about the kind of hateful fake news about little Hugh of Lincoln. So in the 13th century England, anti-Semitic propaganda that little Hugh had been murdered by the Jews, and then that got turned into the forum of not internet memes, but ballads being performed by troubadours traveling around England, which then contributed ultimately to the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290.
So they were mandolin memes? Is that
There were, yes, there were there were harp memes back in the
harp
day.
memes?
Okay. So it's nothing new, but what we do see is with kind of the media of communication changing, the technologies of communication changing, you get different dynamics, different audiences being used, hate speech being used in different ways. And so if kind of the 20th century was an era of centralized communication, right, radio and TV stations, now we're in an era of much more decentralized communication, where now a lot of kind of the hate speech that's taking place and often is most dangerous is taking place on Facebook private groups and WhatsApp chats and things like this, where now there's the capability to, instead of addressing a mass audience, be assembling these very small communities of kind of true believers whose ideas get reinforced over and again and kind of siloed out from the rest of the media, from the mass media, and from kind of the moral world that the wider society shares. And that's where you get then, out of these kind of smaller subcultures, you get people who then will pick up a gun and kill a bunch of people they think are from a rival community. And when they're doing it, they've been convinced by the echo chamber that they're in that it's an act of morally righteous, self-realization that they're doing this.
Well, and the big difference, I guess, from a terrorism perspective that I was studying for a long time and reporting on, it used to be that if you had a violent sort of extremist idea, you would talk to yourself about it. And now you can find other people to reinforce that idea so easily. So instead of having that idea die away because nobody seems to be agreeing with you at school, for example, or on campus, now you can find the small group of people who just reinforce those ideas. And that's what really changes it. Sally, I'm going to pick on you next. There seems to be a pushback on efforts to try and explain this. Is this free expression? There are people who think that banning speech necessarily curbs expression. And there are those who say that the words themselves are not harmful. How do you address those schools of thought in your effort to combat hate speech around the world?
Great question. So we actually think of it in slightly different terms. I feel like those are two schools of thought that put you in silos that you kind of can't get out of. And what we look at is called dangerous speech. It's a specific framework coined by Suzanne that talks about any form of expressions, whether it's speech or text or images, that can either incite or cause the audience to either incite or condone violence against another group of people, and that's specific to groups of people. So the way we're looking at it is a little bit different because we want to see, why people are doing this and what are the different factors behind it, rather than, the way you put it. Yeah.
Okay. So what are the top 3 factors?
So they would be, I love talking about this stuff. So the first is the speaker. So you're going to have a charismatic speaker who has a really big audience. They're going to be using language of scapegoating, and their audience is going to be already pre-primed for those messages. So the speaker and the audience are the first 2, and then you have, the medium and the context. The context is really important. If you're in a context where you don't have any tension between groups, then that's going to fall on not necessarily deaf ears, but certainly peaceful ears. So we really have to look at the whole framework to see how and why these things happen.
So this falls into the rubric of Radio 1000 Collines, for example, in Rwanda during the genocide there, in which you have the speaker, Radio 1000 Collines, radio, I think you all know this. This is the radio station that helped foment the genocide in Rwanda. There was a newspaper, Kangora, which also did that. Then you have a receptive audience, and then the violence follows.
Yeah, exactly. As a matter of fact, at the Rwanda tribunal, a woman gave a statement. She said that the hate speech that had been spread by the radio station and by people over the years were like drops of oil or petrol around the country. And one day, all you had to do was light a match, and the whole country would be lit on fire.
What's striking about this too, I wrote a book about the criminal tribunal and the journalists who were put on trial for war crimes for the first time since Nuremberg involved were these Radio 1000 Collines journalists. And if you listen to Radio 1000 Collines and you listen to the translation of it, it does not sound unlike far right-wing radio that we're hearing today. But this was back, in the 90s. So I want to talk to you, Suzanne, next about how we manage this problem. I mean, we were talking last night in the car on the way over about the difference between fake news and fraudulent news. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, fraudulent news is a term that we have taken up at PEN America because we feel like the phrase fake news has been sort of voided of all meaning by a president who calls virtually any coverage he dislikes fake news. So that term's become kind of almost meaningless. Fraudulent news also has the implication of intent. This is information that somebody is purveying with the knowledge that it is false, and so that's it's in our view, a real threat to free expression because it's a free expression organization. The challenge of it is most fraudulent news is protected expression under the First Amendment. You're allowed to lie. You're allowed to, make up a false story. We have protections for satire. So, we have space in our polity for, the purveying of information that is false. But online, the velocity and the impact of false information has kind of taken on an entirely new dimension. Obviously, we saw this so dramatically in the 2016 election where, we'll never know, I don't believe, whether it was determinative in terms of the result, but the scope of it and the deliberate effort to target communities that could be influenced by certain messaging, whether it was to sway their views about a candidate or discourage them from voting, and all of that kind of unseen, by the media, by opposing campaigns, really until long after the election was over. So from our perspective, that is a threat to free expression, even though the expression itself, for the most part, is protected. It's a pollution of our discourse. If you don't know what's true and what's false, the value of being able to speak out and your ability to persuade people really is undercut. So at PEN America, we look at free expression, not just as a battle against overt restrictions on speech, but as a campaign to protect truthful, fact-based discourse. So, how does it tie into hateful speech? Very often these memes and messages that kind of traffic in the realm of fraudulent news, are hateful in a form of hatred. They're defamatory. They target personal characteristics that are based on people's membership in protected classes. So there is an interplay there.
And Agnieszka, I want to ask you if you can tell us a little bit about what's going on in Poland, and in particular the murder in Gdansk, the president, and because I'm not sure everyone knows that particular story. So if you could start with the speech and sort of explain what happened.
Yeah, I'd like to start by saying that Poland has really bad press in the world, and mostly the bad stuff gets out. And my story has actually a good, well, not a good, but a slightly optimistic ending. There is an enormous wave of protests against the polarization and the incitement to violence that has been going on in the media, and it's coming from young people who have been very passive for a long time. So that's sort of the good ending that I'm hoping
to
get to. Yes, but the horrifying story is that we have an increasingly authoritarian government which has been feeding on building polarization. And polarization in Poland is viewed as democracy, basically, as the pitting of opposite sides and the increased aggression. To some extent, I think, is viewed in Poland as viewed as liberation from the previous totalitarian system. So it might be, I think it may be taking us a little too long to realize that something horrible is happening. This polarization is similar to what's going on in Hungary, which you may be more familiar with. And actually, Kaczyński, who is the leader of the populist right in Poland, promised in 2015 that if he wins the elections, he will build a Budapest in Warsaw. And he's been building it ever since. So what happened in January is, on 13th of January, the president of Gdańsk, which is a big city on the Baltic Sea, a much beloved liberal, conservative liberal, very anti-peace president, but a man with a huge following, great charisma, was attacked by a lunatic, this is one version, or a person provoked by hate speech, this is the other version.
They could be the same thing.
They could be the same thing, but it's an interesting debate whether the person doing the violence is crazy or whether the person doing the violence is actually a product of a certain discursive political situation. So he was attacked on the stage of Poland's loveliest event, really. It's the finale of a huge charity event which gathers millions of Polish people to contribute to the health services, which are in shambles. But anyway, so you have a lot of goodwill, children walking around the streets collecting our equivalent of dimes and so on. And then they have this huge concert and people giving speeches, and it's like, the one time during the year when everybody seems to be happy to be Polish. And so this, and it happens all over Poland. And in Gdańsk it was a huge event with great music and so on. And then this guy gets up on the stage and attacks the president of Gdańsk, Adamowicz, who dies the following day.
Does he knife him? What does
he
do?
knifed him, yes. And he was unconscious and he died the following day. And it was a really traumatic event. I don't think we've had anything like this in the last 2 decades.
And how did they link this to hate speech?
And since then, there have been calls from the liberal side to step down on hate speech, to do something about the polarization. The man who attacked Adamowicz had been in prison, and he actually blamed the liberals, as the pre-Kaczyński political circles are referred to by the populist right, for having arrested him wrongfully. He's also clearly deranged. But one thing that we know is that he only had access to public media, to public television while in prison. And there have been studies of what was actually being said about Adamowicz on Polish television in the period when this man was in prison. And there were 100 news broadcasts accusing Adamowicz of all sorts of mostly untrue things.
Such as?
Such as theft, such as conspiracy, such as allowing homosexuals to kidnap children. There's this whole anti-gender component, but basically being a corrupt elite leader responsible for the suffering of ordinary people that this guy considers himself to be.
And you said this is Polish public television. I assume this is different than PBS.
Yes, it's very different. It's one of the first things that the Kaczyński government did was to take over the media. So, in fact, I was recently called by a journalist who tried to invite me to a panel on Polish public television, and she was apologetic, and she said, "I work for so-called public television." So even the journalists who are still working there, they know that it's boycotted by, by pro-democracy people, and that it's kind of a shameful thing to be working there. But it's the only, it's the only TV channel that reaches 80% of Polish population. So what we're dealing with is a kind of monopoly of this, of the populist right on information. And of course, it is highly debatable whether this guy would have done something similar had he not been watching this news. But it is, I think it's very clear to everyone that he is a product of this increased polarization of accusations of conspiracy and especially disdain and the idea that the elites are somehow disdainful of ordinary people. And then, so the ordinary people are encouraged to lash out against the elites in rightful retribution.
It sounds vaguely familiar. And would you say that you study America and Poland, right? You're part of the. So would you say that what's going on in this country is an early precursor, and this is more, or is it totally different? Because your explanation makes it sound similar.
I'm afraid we get to be the, the more advanced party here. In fact, America.
We being Poland.
No, you being America.
Okay.
Actually, Eastern Europe may be the predictor for a lot of stuff going on in Western Europe and in the United States. Some of the hate campaigns, especially around gender, they started in Eastern Europe earlier, in the early 2000s, and France, Germany, Spain followed suit, and I don't think the anti-gender campaigns are quite as widespread in Poland. I mean, in the United States right now. It's not the same as misogynistic hate speech. But interestingly, some of the origins are in the States. But maybe I can talk about this later.
We'll definitely get to the gender
global
thing
doesn't mean it's coming from one place to another. It means uneven dissemination and people talking with each other across continents in ways that we hadn't envisioned a few years ago.
So Noah, we've been sort of hinting at this, and now I want you to sort of dive into it, which is addressing how hate speech is harnessed by political actors. And clearly this happens in the Middle East. Some people would say it's happening in Poland. Can you talk a little bit about how that is progressing?
Sure. Well, so there are, I suppose, two parts to that. The first one is to point out that, this isn't just, lone wolves or individuals acting on their own who are often disseminating hate speech. Often it is highly organized. You have this kind of troll army phenomenon in a lot of countries where often you have in often kind of drab office buildings where people are also doing other kinds of online advertising, political communications work. In Russia, in St. Petersburg Internet Research Agency, or in it's a global phenomenon in these net centers in Guatemala. You see the same thing in Turkey, where I study, where you actually have. Can
you talk about the Turkey one in specific? What is it that they have specifically there?
Sure. Well, it's not totally clear how things are organized. It's often people are able to realize that things are organized based on a huge amount of similarity and among messages. And it'll be the same people who are very on message praising the president right after he makes an announcement, who then will also be directing threats and harassment at opposition figures.
I don't think most people probably know very much about that sort of operation in Turkey. Can you give us a specific sort of cause and effect example?
Specific cause and effect example. Well, so, nowadays, anybody who expresses anti-government views can expect, first of all, to be harassed by ordinary people, and then secondly, and this is getting to the second part of the hate speech, being themselves accused of hate speech. And this has gone hand in hand with what's developed in Turkey, a little bit similarly to what you see in a lot of Eastern European countries, of the government capturing the mainstream media. So what's happened is, over the last decade or so, the Turkish government, more and more, the mainstream newspapers, TV stations have been, with varying degrees of coercion, seized or bought up and handed over to pro-government business people and turned into essentially propaganda outlets. So as the mainstream media has been taken over. What you saw very prominently, for example, in 2013 with the Gezi Park protest movement, was opposition moving to social media. So Twitter usage in Turkey became very high in the early 2010s. That was still a space where even people who didn't have a voice in the mainstream media could be organizing, getting their messages out. So the way that the Turkish government has adapted to that has been twofold. So first of all, kind of there's very good indications that there are organized trolling campaigns in order to intimidate and shut down opposition voices. And then second of all, Turkey is now a world leader in the prosecutions for things like insulting the president, insulting public officials, and a lot of this is happening on Twitter. So in 2017, I think more than 2,000 people were convicted of insulting the president in Turkey. So it's a way of making what had been a little bit of a freer space more controlled by the government, along with the mainstream media.
Suzanne, do you want to comment
Yeah, I mean,
on
just
that?
to say, I think one of the phenomena that you're touching on that concerns us a lot is, while hateful speech is, it's unquestionably a real and dangerous phenomenon, and many folks on this panel, are working on some of its most dangerous and deadly manifestations, and obviously you touched on New Zealand, which we should come back to. There's also a real risk because the term hateful speech and the idea of hateful speech is being manipulated to refer to all kinds of political speech and to become a tool and a weapon to suppress critical speech, of a president, it can be Erdogan or Putin, to get artwork taken off of the walls of galleries because it's offensive to a particular group, and drawing that, putting it on a continuum with incendiary, inciting speech, I think is very dangerous. So the real challenge here is how we tackle the truly deadly potential of hateful speech, particularly as it spreads online, devoid of context, in ways that can be manipulated, receiving, targeted to the most vulnerable and amenable populations who are the most likely to act on it, but without sweeping into our solutions, measures that will suppress all kinds of legitimate speech.
So I assume you don't think community standards are the answer?
I do think they're part of it. I mean, Dina's referring to, of course, the rules that major online platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Google, apply in moderating content that appears, whether it's on YouTube or in a Twitter feed. And I do think they have a role. I don't think platforms should try to adhere to the standard of the First Amendment, where, which is the most protective of speech in the world, where, virtually everything with, there are exceptions, incitement to imminent hatred, harassment, true threats, but it's a very narrow set of exceptions, and, enormous amount of speech is protected. And I think that's the right thing legally, and I wouldn't want to empower our government to control and constrict speech beyond that. But when it comes to these platforms, and particularly the ways in which we see that speech can become so dangerous online, I don't believe that's the right standard. There's a provision that protects right now all platforms from any kind of liability for speech on the platform, because they're sort of treated as a, almost as if, for those in the room who remember kind of the phone companies back in the day, they're treated like the phone company. So the phone company would never be held liable for what, you and I say to each other in a conversation. That concept seems ridiculous. And that's actually the paradigm.
Let me just jump in here so you know what you're talking about in terms of you're talking about the Communications Decency Act, Section 230.
Yes.
So why don't you explain what that is, just so we're all in the...
Yeah, it's our law, and it essentially shields the platforms from any liability for content that's shared, let's say, on Facebook or on Twitter. If someone's murdered because of that content, right now you can't go after the platform for any role they may have played in it. And I think
the idea being that they are just merely, just to take the next step, the idea being that they are merely the platform for this. They're not an editor, they're not they are merely publishing information and not commenting either way on it.
Kind of a transmission channel rather
Right.
than a publisher, right? It's distinct from the liability that a publisher would face. And that provision has been very important to the development of the internet, and most free expression groups for a long time have been very supportive of it, because as a kind of underlying protection that has allowed the internet and these platforms to flourish. But in recent years, we've really seen sort of the dark side of this and the incredible potential that the platforms have, not just to be a place where you can put out an incendiary or even murderous idea, but a place where it can really propagate and gain strength and build up this velocity so that its deadly potential gets realized. So I think we're just kind of coming to grips with how we can maintain the openness that we all love about the internet, while trying to curb some of this, really divisive, polarizing, and even deadly potential.
Yeah, and the idea being that essentially these platforms say, we're not editing, we're not touching this content, and we're not doing that because under the Communications Decency Act, we're merely putting it out there, we're not making an editorial judgment about it. Sally, can you talk a little bit about the connection between this kind of language and violence?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think it's always helpful to kind of understand why we hate and the way that our brains are sort of programmed around it to understand the connection between hate speech or dangerous speech and violence. And the first thing is that it's not actually built on it's not built around hate, it's built around love for what we describe as our in-group. And even if you don't consciously know it, you have a tribe, you belong to them. And it's supposed to be a positive thing. You gain resources, you gain security, you provide resources and security, but at the same time, you are just defining yourself by what you're not as well. And so those out groups can pose a threat to your in-group.
So you're a Hoosier, but you're not a wildcat.
Right.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, yeah, I talk about that all the time. We don't realize that we're tribal in like 40 different ways, right? My husband hates the Patriots, right? Like with a passion. And
Me too.
See?
Everyone hates the Patriots.
Look inside
Okay.
yourselves, people. But it comes back to, then so we're tribal, then we categorize others, and then we assess threats, right? Because survival is our strongest instinct. So fear really guides so much of what we think and do, and we're constantly looking for threats. Now, we don't necessarily just as individuals decide what those threats are. We use heuristics, I always say that wrong, but and we believe what our in-group believes because we trust them. We trust the leaders of our tribes, right? Like I trust, frankly, I'm gonna out myself here, but like I trust Barack Obama, right? I trust John Oliver. What they say, like I trust Pod Save
Rarely
America.
said in the same sentence, by the way, John Oliver and Barack Obama. But
I
okay.
mean, 2024. But the truth is, like, I don't go and then look up everything they say to confirm its veracity, its truth. I just believe what they say, and we all do that. Everybody does that, no matter which tribe you're in. So then that leads to something where if you're being told that another group is a threat to your in-group by somebody you trust, you automatically believe it. You automatically think, you're not thinking, I hate them. The first thing you're really thinking is, I love my in-group. I will do anything to protect them. And what I always tell people who say, how could you pick up a machete or how could you pick up a gun and kill like children, right? And I tell them, if somebody told you over and over and over again that you trust that somebody was coming to kill your family, wouldn't you be ready, willing, and able to take that person down? I know I would be. I abhor violence, but if I really thought that there was a threat to my family, I would be willing to kill the person that the person or group of people, and I would certainly be leery of them at the very least.
And let me just put this in a real life context, then ask you about your American Veterans Project, which I think links to this. The real life context being in Rwanda, Radio Mille Collines over and over again kept saying the cockroaches are coming, the Tutsi are coming, they're going to kill your family, long before the genocide ever started. So everything was primed for violence to happen.
Right.
And So when you talk about in-groups, let's talk a little bit about your American Veterans Project, which I thought was really a cool idea.
And I didn't quite answer your question from before, but that was just a primer to say that the language that you hear from your in-group really does prime you for your beliefs, whether they're positive or negative. And that can lead to violence because nobody's putting your hand on a trigger. I mean, I feel like we need to have a lot more understanding of the nuances of how speech leads to violence. But the point is it can inspire violence. And it's really out of love for your in-group. So that's a long answer. But as far as, sorry, the second part was?
The Veterans Project.
Oh yeah, okay. So there's hope. There's hope, as we promised you. So one of the great things that you can do is find the right messengers. I'm from like deep South Texas. I'm not the right messenger for a lot of the people that I grew up with to talk to them about why they shouldn't think Barack Obama is a Muslim and why they shouldn't think we should build a wall and kill, Mexicans as they cross the border, right? But the Veterans for American Ideals is this amazing group, and it's just one of like thousands of examples of these types of organizations where veterans that have credibility on both sides of the aisle and really in their communities are revered and looked up to. They are trained to stand up for Muslims, immigrants, and refugees within their communities. They hold town hall meetings, they write op-eds, they speak to their neighbors, they do a lot of different types of outreach. And then they form groups within the community that's based around the ideals that you respect me, well, I respect these people, and here's why. And they're the right messenger because people will actually listen to them. And I think we always focus on how do we change people's minds. I always say, how do we soften their beliefs? You're not going to change someone's mind, certainly not in one conversation. Softening their beliefs is a doable thing and one that can, over time, lead to changing hearts and minds and behaviors.
So let's put ourselves in the current context of being on campus and hateful speech on campus. Can we talk about this problem? Suzanne, do you want to start?
I mean, we do a lot of work at Penn America on free speech on campus, and our view is many of these controversies are grounded in tensions on campus about how the university becomes more diverse, equal, and inclusive to reflect the changing demographics of the student population, which our elementary school population here in the United States now has no single ethnic majority, and very soon that's going to be true on college campuses as well, and is true on many college campuses already, depending on what part of the country you're in. And there are pushes and demands to make the university better reflect that. And that has to do with curriculum, it has to do with imagery on campus and what statues, are there Confederate statues up? Where is the legacy of Thomas Jefferson and how is that reflected and dealt with at a place like the University of Virginia at Charlottesville? And at times, that effort and that debate has spilled over into calls to repress and punish speech that is viewed as harmful, hurtful to particular groups. And it's not impossible to understand. The university does play a role as kind of a home and a place of belonging for students when they're there, particularly for students who come from less traditional backgrounds, who may be in a minority on campus. Those feelings of being vulnerable or isolated or menaced in some way or left out are heightened. And there's a kind of extra sensitivity to speech that feeds into it. And so we can understand why there are calls to repress and punish certain kinds of speech, speech that is viewed as making the university kind of a psychologically unsafe environment, or calling for a trigger warning on a syllabus if there's going to be discussion of a topic, let's say rape, that may be very upsetting to certain students. The demand that professors put a warning on the syllabus so that you're alerted ahead of time. If you don't want to engage in that book or that conversation, you can step out of it. The position that we take is that, yes, the university does need to become more inclusive, diverse, and equal, but that we can and must do so without compromising robust protections for free speech and academic freedom. We think these two sets of values need to live together. So when you have somebody like a Milo Yiannopoulos or the white supremacist Richard Spencer who wants to come to campus, you know, what happens typically is they get an invitation from some student group, some organization that thinks it's a good idea to bring this set of views to campus. And they often are a conservative organization that's sort of reacting to the fact that on many campuses, they're in the ideological minority. They may feel very isolated, and sometimes they kind of lash out, and they want to say, well, you know, under the First Amendment, if it's a public university, we're perfectly entitled to invite Milo or Richard Spencer to come to the campus, and, you know, damn it, we're going to do so and show these people. And then, you know, it can trigger protests, can trigger calls to revoke that invitation, to shut the speech down. You know, the view we take is it's better for the university to, if they reject the message of the speaker, they can make that clear, they can reassert their principles, they can offer support to students who sometimes genuinely feel truly menaced by the presence of that voice or that message on campus. But it's better not to shut the speech down. It's better when it goes forward. And we've actually seen, you know, universities are kind of, I think, beginning to find their sea legs where this is concerned, and we've seen some more constructive approaches being used. But these tensions flare up daily, and the president actually today is going to issue an executive order on campus speech, so we're watching out very closely for that. You know, it's fine for him to affirm the primacy of the First Amendment and insist that universities that receive federal research funds, of course, are complying with the First Amendment if they're public universities. We have no problem with that, but we think this is being used to drive an ideological agenda because we know the president is not equally interested in protecting all kinds of speech.
Right. How many of you in the audience have experienced trigger warnings in your classes? Wow. For people who can't see the audience, that's not very many. I'm a little bit surprised. Agnieszka, do you want to talk about this on campus and what's going on?
Yeah, I was actually engaged recently in a debate concerning Jordan Peterson's visit at a Dutch university, and there were student
Remind people
protests.
who Jordan Peterson is.
Who knows who Jordan Peterson is? Wow, I thought he was really famous here because this is America's...
Jordan Peele is. Jordan
Peterson. He's actually a Canadian psychologist / philosopher who has been engaged in really intense debates about pronouns. That's what made him famous. He refused to call people by the pronouns that they wish to be called on, or rather he refused to comply to being forced to use these pronouns, and he was engaged by a number of feminists and trans activists, and that went viral.
Sorry,
on
not
YouTube.
to make light of this,
okay.
but does that mean that he said, hey, you? Or?
No, he said, he said woman, man, and I will decide who you are based on what I see, rather than letting you tell me who you think you are.
Wow.
But actually, it was more complicated than that because he claimed that it was censorship. And he claimed to be which is very typical, by the way, of today's right-wing ideologues, that they don't express views, they rather present themselves as martyrs to either censorship or some kind of coercion. And I think that's why I completely agree with you that this non-platforming, while I cheer for it in the depths of my heart, I would rather not my students be exposed to Jordan Peterson or Milo or whoever is going. I think that the non-platforming actually gives them fuel. It makes it possible for them to present themselves as victims of hate speech. But there's another controversy which happened in Holland, was whether there should be, there were three options: let him speak, engage him, or ban him. And the university actually opted for having him be confronted by another speaker, a feminist. And then Jordan Peterson I think he said no thank you. And he just didn't come. So that was it. But I'm not sure what would have happened if that debate happened, because then that might have gotten a bigger audience, and he probably would have won in terms of just speaking talent. He's incredibly charismatic. Look him up, but don't be carried away. He's really he's a stocky fellow.
On Twitter.
Yeah. So yeah, but in Poland we have the opposite problem, namely public universities, which are now under very strong influence of the right-wing government, are giving their space to orthodox Catholic groups, and by Orthodox I mean way to the right of the Vatican, which claim to be scientific institutions. And actually, people who have been ousted from the academia in the United States, a guy called Cameron, for instance, who claims homosexuality can be cured, has been giving tours, lecture tours in Eastern Europe as an American academic, invited by Catholic organizations.
Are they pushing intelligent design as well?
That hasn't happened yet, actually. I think intelligent design is big in the States, but not so much in Eastern Europe. But there are people talking, giving very orthodox anti-abortion talks, kind of masquerading as science and being invited by public universities. And so you find, so the people who disagree with this are actually outside the institutions. In the States, you have democratic-based institutions deciding on what to do with the haters. In Poland or Hungary, the institutions are already taken over in the sense. So they are the source of this, of what we want to call hate speech, I guess.
I didn't mean to leave you out, Noah. Sorry, just everybody was so interesting. I wonder, just quickly, we're going to go to questions in a moment. So if you want to sort of form the questions that you have in your minds now, I'll go to it in just a few minutes. But let's just quickly talk about technical tools that are available to identify and regulate hate speech online. As someone who's been sort of tracking ISIS for years, I've been quite frustrated by how much ISIS content seems to still be on the web, even though some organizations say 98% of it is down. Can you talk a little bit about that particular aspect?
Sure. Well, so there's, on these social media platforms where so much information is being disseminated these days, there are a few different kind of ways or layers to content moderation. The ideal, of course, would just be if automatically intelligent tools could be used to identify things as they're put online. So far, those tools are very limited in what they can do. So, for example, in the case of the shooting in New Zealand recently, automated tools didn't detect when the shooter was live streaming. Nobody who was watching it immediately reported it. It was only when the video got flagged several minutes later that it first got taken down. Then it did fall to AI tools to be detecting new uploads, and there were millions of those. I think about 1.5 million is what Facebook said in the first day. Most of those then got caught. So once a human moderator has seen, based on content being flagged, that something violates standards and marked it. Nowadays, there are tools for AI to be used to re-identify the same image. To some extent, people have found ways to game that system and work around it, right? You edit the video, you zoom in on it. There are ways to try to kind of trick this system. So a few 100,000 did slip through the cracks still and had to be taken down by people.
So here's something I don't understand. So when we have big swings on the stock market, there's a sort of a stopgap measure that says something weird is going on. We're going to sort of pause things for a second. Why can't that happen online with a platform like Facebook, where there's a big swing in people who are specifically looking at a particular video? Would it make any difference? Suzanne and I were talking about this last night. Would it make any difference if it were just stopped for a moment for people to look and see that there's so much activity, maybe something bad is happening?
Yeah, we had this great conversation on our Uber last night, but we touched on this, and like the fact that all of a sudden thousands, I don't know how many people were looking at something, a video being generated in Christchurch, New Zealand, like surely that is anomalous. Like that's something that doesn't happen on the network every day, has probably never happened. Why can't that trigger an immediate human review to see what's going on and do as Dina says?
Yeah, well, so first of all, the number of human moderators is so limited that they end up relying on kind of outsourcing the initial flagging to users. Another thing, I mean, because Facebook's a global platform, a lot of people who initially watched it, downloaded it, re-uploaded it would have been from all different places in the world. So there's a problem of they don't know that it's the same video when somebody's re-uploaded it from across the world.
But couldn't that
And-
spike without even being a human moderator? We don't have a
Yeah.
human person putting a pause on, we don't have a human putting a pause on the stock market. It's automatic, right? If there's this big swing, there's a
Right.
pause.
Well,
Why
but-
couldn't that be happening?
Well, so I don't know if there was a big swing, like the total Facebook usage or total Facebook video uses, it probably didn't budge in global terms, like the total number of videos being seen. You have to know exactly what's spiking, and that's the problem, is identifying what's spiking.
Okay, but let's, I'm sure people in the audience have some questions about this, and I hope you do, so we can elucidate this more, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to actually, since we have such a great collection of people here, an opportunity to talk to them and ask them questions. So I think there's someone with a microphone. Is there? Yes, there is. There's, okay, in the red t-shirt, that should be easy to see. And there are two people with Hamilton Lugar t-shirts on, so raise your hand, I'll call on you. If you can tell us who you are, maybe what your major is, or what you think it might be, and then make it actually a question as opposed to a statement, that would be awesome. So this young lady in the glasses, in the middle there. Could you stand up, please?
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a freshman and an international studies and political science major. And so while we're on the topic of like monitoring online hate speech and the Christchurch shooting, there's been techniques that, as you said, have brought down like ISIS posts and stuff like that in the past years that have been incredibly effective, even though they haven't completely eradicated it, obviously. So, but those techniques have not been applied to white supremacy. And I was wondering why you all think that is, whether that's political will or like words that we could like target have not been identified yet, just what you all think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so we found that the platforms do work hard to kind of develop tools to be monitoring things effectively when they have a big incentive to do so. So in the case of child pornography, where that's an exception, where platforms actually are held liable for the content they host, they have been very successful at creating a database of all pornographic images. Everything that people upload gets measured against that in order to prevent things from uploading. In the last few years, the similar database has been developed for terrorist propaganda. But in both of these cases also, often it's easier to do videos or particular pieces of speech that have already been identified than to be figuring out what constitutes written hate speech or white supremacy. For instance, in the case of white supremacist speech, it's often difficult, for example, for automated tools to figure out whether somebody's making fun of white supremacy or endorsing it. Also, according to Facebook, for example, standards, until pretty recently, people could essentially game the system and not violate Facebook standards through means that we think of as absurd today. So there were PowerPoint slides used to train Facebook moderators leaked a year or two ago, and they saw that human moderators were being taught, for example, you can't say all white people are terrible, but you can say all black children are terrible. And the formula they had come up with was that, okay, you have certain protected categories like race, gender, sexual orientation, a few others. And if the equation is, the statement says, identifies a group, says something hateful, then it's hate speech. But if there's what they called a subset, a qualifier, like it's only black children who are terrible, then that actually was something that would slip by. When they've been motivated to come up with more rigorous criteria and do a better job of substantively cracking down on this kind of thing, has been when there's either a legal imperative, as in with child pornography, or a financial imperative, as when advertisers are pulling ads from YouTube because they don't want their logo being seen next to white supremacists. And so often, and not coincidentally, when that happened in 2017, a bunch of advertisers pulled from YouTube, they started really investing a lot more in figuring out what was offensive speech and in making sure that ads didn't appear on those kind of speech. So a lot of
So
it is
I think
gonna
your
be-
overall point, though, to get
Yeah.
to what Katie was saying, I don't know that I would say that there's a political reason that they're not doing it. It has more to do with the legal imperative or the advertiser imperative, as opposed to giving white supremacists a buy. I don't think that's the issue. If I can recommend to the students here and to the teachers here too, there's a great article in Vanity Fair this month that takes a look at the community standards and the way they're trying to build them at Facebook. And it sort of focuses in on Monica Bickert, an old DOJ reporter who is trying to lead the charge in this. And interestingly, of the lines that are not allowed, that have been banned, is "men are scum," which is the title of the article, so it'll be easy to find.
Yeah.
Sally.
I would love to just take kind of an opposing view from the rest of the panel on this for a second. I think that Facebook's line that like, oh, it's so hard, and you know, we're trying really hard to, you know, we have thousands of human monitors. They have so many resources. They have so much money. They have been slow to react. They could put 10 times more and it wouldn't, more resources into these efforts, and it wouldn't put a dent in their profits. And frankly, I personally think that they are partially responsible for the genocide in Myanmar. I've worked there for 7 years. We tried to talk to
explain
Facebook.
why, just so everybody's...
So in Myanmar, it was opened up to the rest of the world in 2012. Very quickly, Facebook became the entire internet, basically. Everybody's on Facebook in Myanmar. And there was a very fast spread of hate speech against the Rohingya Muslim population that had already been oppressed for decades. But it really sped up the amount of not only hatred, but violence, like significant mass violence against the Rohingya population. We tried to talk to Facebook from the very beginning of the increased violence, which started in 2012. They were like, here's some stickers that people can put on their, you know, on their Facebook pages to say like, I like flower
Rohingyas?
speech, you know, like literally called flower speech. And like, I don't like hate speech. They could have done so much more, and I completely reject. They're like, oh, we're trying, like BS. Sorry.
Yeah, no, just to say, I don't want to, I mean, I don't think each of us on the panel expressed a view on that, but I agree. I think this Christchurch thing, you know, I'm not convinced that they couldn't have tracked that down far more quickly. I wouldn't support a solution where algorithmically it got shut down just because there was this unusual activity. Because
What if it was a pause, though, as opposed to shutting it down? What if it was a pause?
You know, you wouldn't want 9/11, all videos of 9/11, I don't think, shut down just because it was a crazy spike if we had had these platforms at that time. And I also wouldn't be so sure that there isn't a political dimension when it comes to white supremacy, because let's face it, that term, it gets used very elastically. Obviously, it's a real thing, it's deadly, you know, it's criminal in some of its manifestations, but you also hear the term, you know, some of these terms and ideas used in a very different context, a kind of conflation of white privilege and white supremacy. So I think there, you know, there may be some, I wouldn't be entirely convinced there isn't a political dimension to it. I really agree with what Sally has said in terms of the resource, that they've starved the resources of this. They're over-relying on the algorithms, which are not ready for prime time when it comes to detecting and responding to this stuff. Their moderators are minimum wage people, you know, at big farms in the Midwest and overseas. They need qualified, trained, expert eyes to get on this stuff immediately and make context-specific judgments. And they really have washed their hands of that, you know, claiming it's impossible. It's not impossible. They're doing it in Germany, where they've been forced to do it as a legal matter because of a quite restrictive law on online hate speech with hefty fines, which you know, probably goes too far, but it does demonstrate that they're capable of doing this when they have to.
And when, from my perspective, and then Agnieszka, I'll let you jump in here. When it came to ISIS recruiting in the United States, not just the intelligence agencies, but also Army Cyber Command was trying really hard to try and bring down these sites or find some way to step in and stop these sites from being able to recruit kids. Cyber Command got zero help from Facebook. They asked for it. They ended up having to figure it out on their own to sort of create an offensive cyber sort of initiative to take down some of these recruitment videos without Facebook's code. So they had to code around Facebook's code. So it's been an issue for a really long time. Were you going to say something on that?
Yeah, I'm actually really grateful for the article you circulated, and maybe you should advertise it, on dangerous speech. One of the problems in automated filters for this stuff is that it looks so innocent. A lot of it is not saying the other guys need to be killed because they're vermin and rats and infestation and so on. It says they're out to get your children. Be careful, guard your children against, in Poland the word is genderists. I think the most influential type of hate speech going on around Europe right now is the anti-gender campaign. And there are no words that you could flag. They're basically saying there are these people out there who are liberals, who are funded by George Soros, and they're out to get your children. And then in different countries, they make different associations. Sometimes in Spain right now, it's feminazis is the term. And there are buses going on around Spain. This actually ended a few days ago with Hitler's face and hashtag Stop Feminazis.
What's a feminazi?
A feminazi, you should know. This actually comes from the U.S. From the alt-right circles.
I may know, but I would like you to
explain. It actually goes back to the 80s.
It's like you're really into equality.
It's not the way I'm moderating.
Feminazi is a feminist as perceived by the alt-right, but actually the word was born in the 80s in the States during the height of the culture wars. But the buses you can stop, you can throw things at them. But when you have this circulating as a hashtag, and it seems to be circulating as a joke, and then things add up to that joke that are about children being forced to wear the other gender's clothes, for instance. One of the things that gets circulated around Europe a lot is the World Health Organization standards for sexual development of children. And with the implication that the World Health Organization wants to force masturbation on preschool children, and that this is the work of the genderists. How do you control that? I mean, this is actually a chart lifted from the World Health Organization website. It's the context that makes it hate speech. So I think you would really need, people who are informed about the type of conspiracy theory, the implications, the versions of it to stop it. You can't do it automatically.
Noah, can I give you another bite of this apple since everyone said
Yeah,
that? So,
thank you. Well, first off, I hope I wasn't coming off as saying, shucks, Facebook is just doing their best. I completely agree with what Sally and Suzanne said on that count. Except insofar as it seems like maybe I'm misreading this also, but you seem a bit more optimistic than I am. I don't think that you're ever actually going to stop this, in part because there's a popular demand for this hate speech, right? Hate speech is like a good in the economic sense, not the moral sense. And there's a demand for it. And you see that, the fact that 1.5 million times this video got uploaded and people were clamoring to see it, shows you that there is a demand to view it. And in part, I think as Sally was saying before, a lot of this relates to kind of people feeling like for one reason or another, they're disaffected, they're not being valued by the broader society, and they're looking for a new tribe to join. And hate speech is providing them a new narrative where they're the heroes.
And the victims.
They're the heroes and the victims, right? But not all tribes are created equal, right? You can be a Hoosier and not think you're in an apocalyptic death match with the Wildcats, right? You can have a tribe that's more tolerant and pluralistic. And so I think a lot of this, it's not just a job for regulators. This isn't just a job for engineers or for policymakers. A big part of the people on the front line here are going to be novelists and filmmakers and social media influencers who are creating their own kind of community, alternative kinds of communities for people who otherwise feel left out, but that aren't horrible and hateful. So we don't just need engineers and policymakers, we also need artists and we need storytellers. Right. That's part of addressing
Let me try and get some more questions here. On this side, is there a microphone? Thank you. Can you tell us who you are, please?
Hi, I'm Maria, and I have a question specifically
What's your major?
Oh, International Studies and Chinese Language and Culture.
Oh, okay. Easy.
Yes, there's a lot. So my question specifically regards Vladimir Putin's newly signed law restricting speech against the government, against their state, against even just the flag and Putin himself. How do you see this act as a precedent for rulers of countries and governments on the world stage who are pushing this form of state censorship, and how do you think that sort of enables other countries to follow suit in this way?
Agnieszka, do you want to do that? Or,
I'll actually hand it over.
or Suzanne, why don't you tell us?
I'll have to speak to that. I think it's a major blow, and it's a reflection of what's happening around the globe. Agnieszka is touching on this in terms of Poland and Hungary. You study China. There is an alternative model to all the kind of values and principles that I think places like this institution and the two leaders that it's named for, have stood for and held dear. That has to do with human rights and the rule of law and freedom of expression. And there is a challenge being mounted on the global stage, led out of Beijing and Moscow, to say there's an alternative paradigm. And what this paradigm offers, for leaders, you can stay in power. For people, we offer you stability. We offer you the ability to, get closer to your in-group, to push out that which you do not like. And there are laws and policies that can advance this alternative vision. And it's being advanced in the United Nations. The concept of cyber sovereignty is a direct attack on the idea of digital freedom that our country helped to instantiate. And I think that's, it's a grave danger. And I think, right now we're kind of down for the count because we don't have an administration that can lead a charge in opposition to this. And, the issues in Europe, have compromised Europe's ability to stand against it as well. So, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that law, even the fact that it kind of just, was a bit of a fizzle as far as international news is concerned, is a reflection that these alternative ideas are on the march, they're moving forward, they're being adopted, and we're, the United States is not playing its signal role in standing up for the values that we have championed and the international system that we built.
Which actually means people like us have to do it, because this ground has been ceded. Other questions? Way in the back, please.
Hi, my name is Megan, and I'm a graduate student in Russian and Eastern European Studies. Agnieszka, you mentioned or hinted at in the Polish incident the role of kind of youth protests against that killing, and I was wondering if you could talk about how to overcome mass pacificity, especially in societies that don't have a strong civil society or free press.
And let me add to that, Sally, maybe you can come on to the end of that and talk about the people in Burma that you empowered to find hate speech. So go ahead, Agnieszka, you go first.
Well, I wish I knew the answer to your question. I've been watching young kids in Poland get mobilized for the first time since '89, actually. We've had a notoriously passive student population. And it started, I would say, 4 years ago, and the largest protests were the so-called black protests against an effort to ban abortion. Suddenly we had hundreds of thousands of mostly young and mostly, but not exclusively, women marching to defend women's rights, and everybody was just stunned. But the answer, oddly enough, is Facebook. We've been saying horrible things about Facebook, but actually that's where young people mobilized in these, one of the largest groups called Gals for Gals grew overnight from like a few girls getting angry about this proposed legislation to tens of thousands the next morning. And they were really amazed, like, why is everybody here on my Facebook profile? So these things happen, and I wish I knew the answer, how they happen, when they happen, but they do happen on social media.
Sally, can you tell us about what you were doing in Burma with the young people?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite examples of sort of positive movement is in Rakhine State. This is where the Rohingya live and where the Rohingya genocide is occurring still. There are young people that are being trained they're Rakhine Buddhists. So they're actually on the, if you would call it the perpetrator side, but not to say that they are perpetrators. And they're being trained in human rights issues and freedom of religion issues. And it's not to beat them over the head and say how wrong they are, it's actually to introduce them to the concepts. And many of them have started these outreach clubs to local monks and local monasteries to talk to them about changing the way they speak about the Rohingya. And because they're young people and because they're so excited and they're getting engaged, they've actually had a lot of success in getting monks to not only say, okay, I won't use that hate speech anymore against the Rohingya, but to go up and talk about renouncing it and to pass out materials. And so young people can really, they really do have the power because they can get so excited, and frankly, other generations, they can be inspired by like the new energy that they bring to the table. Yeah.
That's really interesting. This gentleman here in the blue shirt had a question, right here in the, there we go.
Hello. My name is David. I'm an MPA student. I wanted to say...
Just a second, we have a microphone problem. Maybe try again.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. My name is David. I'm an MPA student at SPIA. One of the things I think is going to be a recurring topic with regards to hate speech in the near future is going to be young people's increasingly critical views of America's relationship with Israel, which has it's caused a lot of accusations for left-leaning figures like Jeremy Corbyn or Ilhan Omar in the United States that they're effectively pushing anti-Semitism. Recently, a lot of people have pushed back on this accusation and said that it's this accusation is actually a way of chilling legitimate criticism of Israel's policies and actions in the Middle East. How do you think we avoid sort of spiraling down into a sort of unproductive accusation pushback cycle while we hash out, our changing relationship with Israel?
I think it's a great question, a really important question. And I think the events of the last few weeks, the controversy around the remarks by Ilhan Omar, and then Chelsea Clinton, who attended this kind of memorial event for the Christchurch victims, and then was confronted for having tweeted or sent out a message that was critical of Omar, suggesting that her remarks were anti-Semitic, and then Chelsea Clinton was accused of being playing into an anti-Muslim trope, and sort of the question was, well, what are you doing here at this event? You're unwelcome here, and it's really hard to answer because I think the answer is sort of context and nuance and precision, and those are sort of the enemies of our online discourse. All those things really just get lost because I think, of course, there's anti-Israel speech that can be anti-Semitic. That doesn't mean all anti-Israel speech is anti-Semitic. We need to be able to have a debate about our relationship with Israel without it necessarily, people necessarily being accused of anti-Semitism. Yes, there are kind of historic tropes that get brought up that really do have a linkage with an anti-Semitic lineage or history. No, it's also true the speaker in using those tropes might not be aware. Yes, they should become aware. They should be educated. So all these things are, and yes, you should be able to criticize commentary, that's genuinely anti-Semitic without being accused of being anti-Muslim. There are other people who then jump on it with an anti-Muslim agenda and make death threats, and then the accusation comes back to somebody who may have said something perfectly moderate and reasonable. So, the question is, what do we do? And I think it comes down to sort of leadership on all sides. And I think the point you made about kind of who is well positioned to speak out is a very good one. And there are people in both communities, or a range of different communities on the sides of this debate who I think are trying to exercise their leadership in a responsible way. Muslim Americans who are, acknowledging anti-Semitism, Jewish leaders who are acknowledging that, criticism of Israel is legitimate and must be permitted. And I think it's kind of amplifying and, those voices and pointing out those voices. Ultimately, that's the best solution. We have a problem because in our political leadership, there are few of those voices, and I think that's where it's needed most.
Agnieszka, do you want to address that super quickly because we have to end exactly on time?
I just want to say that culture wars motivate everyone to make very simple statements that will kind of kill the enemy. And what we really need is complexity, and that's what we should all be engaging in.
And also waiting a beat, I think, before we respond to some things. So I'm sorry we've run out of time. We could be talking about this, I think, for quite a bit longer, but I just wanted to conclude by talking and addressing to the students in the audience that you can actually help stop a lot of this, and that if you go beyond your in-group, if you befriend a Northwestern alum instead of just an Indiana alum, and this idea of softening your beliefs instead of just deciding somebody's going to change your mind. I mean, of the things that we've said, it's such a great way of looking at it that maybe what you should do is go and listen to speakers who don't agree with you and see if A, that softens your belief, or B, that maybe you can find a way to soften yours. I mean, one of the things that we understand as journalists is that we need to talk to people who don't agree with us so we can understand them better. And I think that is what has been lost, is this ability to reach out and try to understand people who aren't like you. So I guess one of the messages that I'd like you to take away is go hug a Northwestern alum at some point today. And we used to row against you guys. You beat us all the time. And think about whether or not you're getting in your in-group too much and in your filter bubble. And see if you can reach out and talk to people who don't agree with you and try to understand them a little better. So if you wouldn't mind, let's give the big hand to the panelists. Thank you very much.